Sacred soul remembrance, how had I, who had been done with everything that had no longer served my soul's highest self and sacred purpose, who had detached with love and clarity from every attachment, expectation, and identity that had not honored my truth. How had I chosen myself, not from ego, but from self-respect, self-worth, and divine remembrance? How had I remembered that choosing myself had been choosing alignment, dignity, and integrity? How had I released the need to be seen, approved, rescued, or validated? How had I stood rooted in wholeness, knowing nothing had been missing? How had I rested in God's grace, trusting that what had been released had made space for what had already been prepared? How had my nervous system remembered how to be still, safe, and sovereign? How had my worth no longer been negotiated, proven, or explained? How had my boundaries become gentle, firm, and loving reflections of my self-respect? How had abundance within responded effortlessly to my alignment? How had peace, clarity, and quiet joy become my natural state of being? How had I flowed forward unattached, faithful and free, walking in truth, guided by inner knowing, and held in eternal light? In sacred soul remembrance, how had I, who had been done with everything that had no longer served my soul's highest self and sacred purpose, who had detached with love and clarity from every attachment, expectation, and identity that had not honored my truth. How had I chosen myself, not from ego, but from self-respect, self-worth, and divine remembrance? How had I remembered that choosing myself had been choosing alignment, dignity, and integrity? How had I released the need to be seen, approved, rescued, or validated? How had I stood rooted in wholeness, sacred soul remembrance. How had I, who had been done with everything that had no longer served my soul's highest self and sacred purpose, who had detached with love and clarity from every attachment, expectation, and identity that had not honored my truth. How had I chosen myself, not from ego, but from self-respect, self-worth, and divine remembrance? How had I remembered that choosing myself had been choosing alignment, dignity, and integrity? How had I released the need to be seen, approved, rescued, or validated? How had I stood rooted in wholeness, knowing nothing had been missing? How had I rested in God's grace, trusting that what had been released had made space for what had already been prepared? How had my nervous system remembered how to be still, safe, and sovereign? How had my worth no longer been negotiated, proven, or explained? How had my boundaries become gentle, firm, and loving reflections of my self-respect? How had abundance within responded effortlessly to my alignment? How had peace, clarity, and quiet joy become my natural state of being? How had I flowed forward unattached, faithful and free, walking in truth, guided by inner knowing, and held in eternal light? In sacred soul remembrance, how had I, who had been done with everything that had no longer served my soul's highest self and sacred purpose, who had detached with love and clarity from every attachment, expectation, and identity that had not honored